Hi everybody, I'm Dennis. I'm back in the bindery here today, but I'm going to be doing something a little bit different. Instead of making books, I'm going to be looking at paper. In a recent video, Adam Savage made his own handmade book, and he used an interesting handmade, medieval, antique-looking paper, and I thought, I need to get some of that for myself. I've ordered some, and I have it here. So what we're going to do in today's video is take a good look at this paper, test it out with a bunch of different materials, so whether you're a bookbinder like me, or an artist, or just want to print up some neat stuff on old-looking paper, then I think this video is going to be really interesting for you. So let's take a look. So this paper is made and sold by Nomad Crafts Company. I'm not affiliated with them at all. I paid for this myself, so I'll be giving you my actual opinion. This pack is the A4 size. I paid, I think it was $36 Canadian for this. In the US, it retails at about $30. I will put a link in the description if you are interested in getting some for yourself. There's supposed to be 75 sheets of paper in here, so let's open it up and take a look at them. Got some information in here. So this paper is described as being a vintage, handmade, deckled edge paper. It claims to be 150 GSM, acid-free, that it'll work with any medium, watercolor, pen and ink, etc. Described as having a slick and smooth surface and no bleed through. So what I'm going to do with this paper is give it a full test drive with a number of different media. I've got paints and inks, as well as evaluating it for its weight, grain direction, and its suitability as bookbinding paper. So let's take a look at it. So first impressions, you can see that these definitely do have a deckled edge. That means that they have this untrimmed, sort of loose, shaggy edge, which is a hallmark of handmade paper. Flipping through, I can see there's really quite a lot of variation in the color. A lot of them seem to have like water spots. And of course, these are advertised as being a medieval, vintage, antique-looking paper. So in that sense, I think it's exactly what I would expect. It definitely looks old. The color, very much a tan brown sort of color. As far as the surface being slick and smooth, I would say not at all. It's quite textured. I mean, it does look handmade. You can see the impression of the screen that was used to lift the paper pulp out of the water. And each of these sheets, they have a crease in the center of every one, like they've already been folded. So if you're thinking of using this paper for prints or art, I can see that being a big drawback, though for my purposes, I think it's okay. I mean, they're a nice size to fold into signatures to make a book, although the fold's not in the center. Yeah, the fold is definitely off center. Some of the pages have an impression of, looks like a clip of some sort, so maybe these were actually hung to dry. So insofar as the appearance of the paper, I would say pretty much as advertised, very antique looking, very handmade looking, a lot of variation in there. I would say the surface finish, not really what I expected. I wouldn't say rough, but definitely not smooth. So what I'd like to do now is give this paper a proper test drive. I want to test it for acidity, which it claims to be acid-free. I want to test the paper grain direction, and then get into using some writing materials and art supplies on this paper and put it through its paces, see how it performs. I'm going to grab a couple of pieces at random here to be my test subjects. Let's take that one and that one. The rest I'll put aside. And I happen to have a brand new cutting mat here. So the first thing I want to do is check and see what the actual GSM is of these papers. It claims to be 150. So I'm going to cut two samples, 10 centimeters by 10 centimeters from each of these sample pages, and I'll weigh those. And then with a little bit of math, I'll be able to calculate the actual GSM weight of these two papers. So there we are, a couple of 10 centimeter squares. All we need to do is put our paper on the scale, see how many grams a 10 by 10 centimeter piece weighs, and then multiply that by 100, and we've got our gram weight. So this one's coming in at 133 GSM, a little bit lighter than advertised. Let's try the other one. Wow, this one's 165 GSM. If I put both samples on at the same time though, I get 300 GSM divided by the two pieces. So on average, 150 GSM. That makes sense, and with handmade papers there's always going to be some variability, so I think that's acceptable. To test for acidity in this paper I'm going to be using this, which looks like a Sharpie, but it's actually a pH testing pen. The way this works is where you draw a line, read it when it's dry, and if it turns yellow, it's acidic. If it's purple, it means it's neutral or alkaline. To demonstrate, I've got some Permalife paper here. This is an archival quality paper, pretty much guaranteed to be acid-free. And for my sample of an acid, I've got an old paperback book, which you may recognize this film.
Don't I know you?
You can see the paper is already quite yellowed. In fact, the paper is pretty similar color to our sample papers. So first I'll try the Permalife paper. I'll just make a small mark up here in the corner. We can see that's turned pretty distinctly purple. And if we try our paperback here, right, so that's clearly quite acidic. So what we're looking for, make a mark on there and to see it turn purple. Let's see what it does. Hey, that looks pretty good. Let's try the other sample piece as well. Yeah, so I would say confirmed. This pen isn't a super scientific test, but it gives a really good indication that this paper is, in fact, more or less acid-free. The next thing I want to do is check this paper to see if it has a grain direction. I'll turn back to my original sheet, and I know that this is the long grain direction. So I'll just make a couple of cuts on the corner. I explained this grain direction test in my beginner bookbinding series. If you haven't seen those videos, I'll put a link in the description. You can check them out. Basically, I'll use a little bit of water to dampen the paper on just one side, and I'm going to look for any curling that occurs. And so you can see the paper isn't curling dramatically more in one direction than the other. It appears to be pretty equal. So I'm going to say that this paper does not have a grain direction at all, which is good. It means you can use it in whichever orientation you want, either in the long grain direction or the short grain direction, the way it was originally folded. Okay, so I'd say we've got the physical properties of the paper sorted out. Now it's time to see how it performs with some writing and art materials. Let's take a look at those and see what I'm going to use to test it. So as you can see, I've got a pretty wide array of art supplies and writing materials here. I've got a number of different fountain pen inks inked up in these various pens. I've got some broad nib calligraphy pens, pencils, charcoal. I've got both technical pens and some art markers up here. Over here we've got watercolor paints. We can systematically go through using each of these and see how this paper performs. I'm going to start simply just with pencil. This is a Palomino Blackwing. I'm going to start just by writing the type of paper on here for posterity. And right away, writing in pencil on that seems really nice. Maybe we'll do a little sketch, something on here. A little jar that's on my windowsill. And this isn't an art tutorial. I'm just fooling around, seeing how this pencil works on our paper. I could try blending some of this. It fills in some of the texture on the paper, makes it a little bit more even, so it's not too bad. And this being a toned paper, I could probably use a white pencil to do some highlights. It's actually works pretty well, so that's not too bad. Basic little drawing, so that you get an idea of the texture. It's a nice paper for pencil. I suspect for charcoal would be much the same. Let's try that. Simple. So you can see some of the texture of the paper there. Gives it a nice rough feel. There's a very vintage look. Quite like it for dry media like that. I don't have any colored pencils here, unfortunately. Or do I? Let's put those there. Add a little tint to my bottle here. I don't know, maybe this just needs to take a little bit more time, but I just feel like the texture is a little bit too heavy for the pencil to work through. I don't know. You colored pencil artists out there, you let me know if you think a nice textured paper would be the way to go. Let's try a few different colors. So that's colored pencil on there. So for dry media, I think this paper is pretty adequate, you know, as long as you understand that it's a fairly rough texture. Let's move on to maybe some pens and see how that goes. I think I'll start with my technical pens and then move on to the wetter inks after that. So for my technical pens, I've got a Staedtler pigment liner. It's 0.3 mil, and a really fine line Pigma Micron, 0.005. Maybe do a little outlining or cross-hatching on my my sketch here. Now maybe it's the pen, but it feels a little bit dry. Like the paper is maybe coated somehow. Of course, I'm drawing over my pencil and pencil crayon already, so let's maybe try something fresh over here. Let's draw a book. Do a little sketchy sketch. This is how I do a lot of my design ideas, actually. Oh, it's not bad. Paper feels just a little bit like it's coated a little bit. Let's try the other pen. Yeah, I think it was the pen. This feels a little bit better. Yeah, I think for a dry pen, for like a dry ink like this feels pretty good. I don't know, we're just making it up as we go here. It's more about the paper than the drawing, right? That's not too bad. Try a few of these other pens now. I've got a couple of gel pens here. It's a black Sarasa pen. And this is a jelly roll, a white one, that I borrowed from my daughter's art kit. You know what, this the gel pen feels really satisfying on this paper, I gotta say. Let's try this white one. Add some highlights here. I do like a toned paper for doing white highlights. Yeah, it's okay, it's not bad. Cool. Let me show you that. So the paper is doing well with this ink. I think you can do some really cool sketches on here. Let's go back to our colored pencils. Good stuff. Oh, I've got this green pen too. Let's try that. This is a Pilot High Tech Point. Yeah, the paper's not drawing up and blotting the ink terribly. I've seen that happen sometimes. So the next thing I want to try is some other kinds of markers. I got a couple of Copics, which I understand are some of the better ones. And the paper seems very absorbent, and the color, yeah, we're not really getting any pure color. I think for marker, you'd probably want these to work more on a pure white paper for colored marker, but I may be wrong. You marker artists can fill me in. Let's try some of these other guys. The paper seems very absorbent. You can see the ink is just flowing out and being sucked up by the paper like a blotting paper. I guess it depends on the marker. What is this guy? Azure. Oh, it's a Royal Langnickel marker. I mean, there's some interesting shading happening here. And of course, blending seems to be working pretty well here. Let's try just some aimless doodles. I mean, the markers make marks. So we're getting close on these. Oh, and one of the other things that this paper claimed was that it had no bleed through. So let's flip this over and have a look. I would say that that is false. That with the alcohol markers definitely getting some significant bleed through it. The dry media and the technical pen ink, that seems to be fine, no problems there. But the alcohol markers are definitely having their way with this paper. Let's move on to paint, and then we'll finish off with some fountain pen inks and see how this paper handles those. I think maybe for the watercolors I'll test some of my little squares. Just do a little painting there. I'm not much of a painter, so don't expect great results, but we'll see how the paints go onto the paper and what happens. So I guess I'll start by doing a bit of a wash on here. And it's looking pretty blotchy. I mean, it almost looks like the surface of the paper is starting to roll up a little bit, get a little bit loose. Yeah, and the fibers of the paper are pulling up. And the more I rub it, it seems to be peeling away. And as I am not a watercolor painter, I'm not an expert, but I'm going to surmise that that is less than ideal. I mean, I could try the same thing on a piece of watercolor paper and see what that looks like. And we'll do a little side-by-side here with exactly the same brush, exactly the same paint. So obviously the color of the paper is going to make a big impact, but the actual watercolor paper has a much more even look. If I wasn't actively trying to roll up the surface of this paper, it might be okay, but it just doesn't have the same sort of hard finished surface that a watercolor paper does. Let's try a different color though and give it a fair shake. Add a little yellow and make some green down here. It's definitely more absorbent than the watercolor paper. Just seems to be sucking up the paint. Which now I'm getting more variation in my color because I had to go back and pick up some more. So there's our side by side. Now we'll just keep fooling around with colors here a little bit. And we'll do the same over here. So apart from the surface texture of this paper and the color, which is sort of tinting our entire little painting here, I'm getting a lot of warping with this paper. There's a little bit happening with our watercolor paper control piece here, but it feels like it's a little bit more extreme. So I'm going to say that you can apply watercolors to this paper. It doesn't really seem to be bleeding through, but it doesn't seem ideal. So just based on that little sample, I'm going to say that if you're adventurous, you can use watercolor on it. But if you're looking to buy it as a primarily watercolor paper, probably not for you. Okay, let me move on to trying some fountain pens. When I'm all done, I'll give you my final thoughts. So I've got here a whole variety of fountain pen inks. I took the time to ink up a whole bunch of pens. As I'm going, I'll try some writing samples with different pens, different size nibs, different inks, and see how those perform on this paper. First combo, we're going to start with basic black. I've got platinum carbon ink here, and I've got my Pilot Metropolitan inked up with black. It's a fine nib, and let's just write the name of this paper on here to begin. First impression, much like the technical pens, is that this paper feels really dry. Like, I know this pen pretty well, and it usually flows a little bit better. For example, this is just standard copy paper, and it's, you know, I don't get too much skipping. But if I try the same thing here on the Nomad paper, it just feels drier. It feels like it's skipping out a little bit. What it's not doing, and I thought it might, would be to really bleed through a lot. It's really quite the opposite that I had expected. It feels a little drier than what I thought it might have been. Okay, let's try another pen. Here I've got Noodler's turquoise ink, which in my experience is a really, really wet, juicy ink. And I've got it in a TWSBI, I forget the model. I don't know, it's a fine point. Probably misspelled turquoise. So this is a really wet ink. It smudges a lot. Me being a lefty, I don't actually use it very much. So I'm actually getting some of that smudging here. I mean, I'm pretty happy that it's not bleeding out through all the fibers. And like I said, this is a pretty wet ink. But some of the fibers of the paper are actually pulling up and getting stuck in the nib. So let's give this a real challenge. Here I've got, this is a Fountain Pen Revolution pen with like the Superflex stainless steel nib, I believe. And the ink that I've got in it, it's Platinum Forest Black. I really like this pen. I use it a lot, and I like the flex. Let's see what it does on this paper though. just railroading all over the place. It's not the pen. I can show you on this copy paper. The pen writes really well. It's nice and juicy. No problems with flow in this pen, but as soon as it touches this paper, it wants to run out. Just railroading all over the place. So, I don't know, it feels like the paper is somehow coated. And so wet media is just not really having a good time with it. This is another really wet ink. I don't know what this pen is. Maybe someone could help me find out. It's an Aero, E-R-O. Actually bought it in a thrift store for a couple of bucks. And I've got it inked up with Noodler's Apache Sunset, which again is it's a great ink, very nice shading ink, very wet ink in my experience. It's not too bad. But again, I can feel the surface of the paper sort of abrading, so not ideal. Let's take a closer look at that. So those are fine tip pens. Let's move on to some. I've got a broad nib here and a couple of parallel pens. Let's see what this paper makes of these bad boys. This pen, it's a Pilot Metro with a stub. I forget which size. It's like a 1.1 millimeter or something like that. And the ink in this guy, I think, is the J. Herbin Lidité. I like this one for doing like a sort of a calligraphy script. You know, I kind of like how this combination is working with this paper between the stub nib and the ink. And the paper's not really got any significant feathering that I can see, not from this distance. Maybe on the zoom you guys can tell me. And bleed through, non-existent. Looks pretty good. Let's try these parallel pens and give it a real test. This one, I forget the size. This is like, I don't know. Oh, there it is, 2.4 mil. And this one's inked up with Rohr and Klinger Alt Goldgrün, which is just a gorgeous ink, but I find it to be very wet and smudgy. Got my weird left-handed calligraphy style happening here, but so be it. No, this is much worse. Let's try pulling. This the broad nib is just really this isn't working too well with the parallel pen. I find that the Alt Goldgrün doesn't play well with a lot of types of paper, unfortunately. It's such a gorgeous ink. If I push, which with my particular weird left-handed style, I do kind of a lot, it's tearing up the paper. Yeah, it's just, I've got fibers right in the pen, which is less than ideal. This is not the smooth surface paper that was advertised, so I'm going to give up on trying to make that work. This is the 1.5 mil, and this is inked up with Red Dragon. You can definitely use the fine corner of the parallel nib. This is better, actually. It's better than I expected. The Red Dragon is a better behaved ink, in my opinion. This is working a little bit better. It's still not ideal. The paper is still a little bit soft and it can't really stand up when it's wet to the nib. So I'm going to say for calligraphy, really depends on the ink that you're using. I've got a dip pen here. Glass pen. Whoops. So I can try another kind of ink in there. Let's go for this Diamine. Is it Diamine or Diamine? I don't know. Diamine Meadow. Nice bright green ink. Not terrible. Feedback that I get from the paper, it just feels fairly rough and like it wants to tear apart when it's wet. It doesn't have really good wet properties, in my opinion. I've also got some Higgins calligraphy ink that I could try it with another dip pen. It's got the ink reservoir cap on it. See what that does with this Higgins calligraphy ink. Less than ideal, I would say. This does seem to have some feathering where the wet ink is bleeding in, being absorbed by the paper. And again, I don't have any fibers caught in there right now, but it really did feel like it was tearing up the surface of the paper. And I just thought there's one more test that I want to try with this. I want to see what this paper does if I try and run it through my printer. Okay, here's our printout. I gotta say, it looks pretty good. This is a design of book plates that I made. Incidentally, this exact file is available for purchase. You can download it and print these yourself from my Etsy shop. But if we take a close look, I think the detail turned out pretty well. Had no trouble feeding this single sheet through the printer. And it looks nice and sharp. In fact, you can see my little logo right there. No bleed through. So you could definitely print these both sides, and if you had a book that you wanted to print in this format, you could absolutely do that. This paper doesn't have a grain direction, so you could print it up and bind it along this center crease, or even if you wanted to make, I guess, an A8 book, that size would work as well. In fact, I think that looks really cool. Okay, so what's my final opinion on this Nomad handmade paper? Well, it's not a do-all paper. It's not going to do everything that you want. I think it's particularly good for dry media. So for pencil, pastels, colored pencils, just fine. I think you'll be very satisfied with it. Just keep in mind that it has a slightly rough texture. And you can get away with using gel pens. Certain ballpoint pens would be just fine on here, as well as some technical pens. Mixed results with the markers, that's really up to your personal style, but it does bleed through pretty heavily. The bleed through wasn't quite as bad with the fountain pen inks. You can see there's really nothing that came through here at all, but I was pretty dissatisfied with the surface quality of the paper when working with fountain pens. Likewise for watercolor, I don't think it's really a great watercolor paper. The surface just can't stand up to the moisture. Where I was really impressed was with the print quality from my laser printer. For any kind of printed material, I think this paper would work really well, especially where you want to achieve that antique look. I'm thinking bookbinding, but for art projects or even role-playing maps or handouts, it would be really good for that. So overall, I think this paper is a really good value for handmade paper. Handmade papers can be pretty expensive, and $30 for 75 sheets, that seems like a pretty good value to me. This has been a different sort of video for the channel, so if you got something out of it, then please give it a like. It really does help. And if you hit the notification bell, then you won't miss out on any of my new videos. If there's other kinds of paper that you'd like to see me test drive, then do let me know down in the comments. I'll see if I can source some of those. And if this video is well received, I might do more like it. So that's all for now. Thanks very much for watching. I'm Dennis, and I'll see you in the next video.